Malazan Book of the Fallen is a fantasy series that retains its own status of infamy among the fantasy book fan community. People will call it the most difficult fantasy series to get into, with its immense scope and grandiose complexity. The writing style is unforgiving, with Steven Erikson, the writer, following a very strict show not tell principle, choosing to unfold his grand vision in an almost merciless manner, dropping the reader right in the middle of his world without paying any regard to trying to signpost, explain, or establish the rules and principles that govern his world in a palatable way. Instead, the reader is expected to power through, piecing together and learning about this truly massive world step by step. As a result, the common conception is that confusion for the reader is something to be expected, and that the way to read the series is to make peace with that confusion. Me, being the ever-ambitious person I am, having a lot of experience with the fantasy genre, having read the Game of Thrones series and the Wheel of Time, both massive series, had my sights set on Malazan for a while. I was determined to pick up the books and read through them, and the reputation of the series did not deter me. After all, even though the reputation of the books are that they are difficult read, it's also a common takeaway that once you power through, the satisfaction of reading through the series is supposed to be immense. Erikson supposedly manages to bring together the massive complexity of his world in the latter section of his series in an incredibly grandiose manner, paying off everything in a spectacular, breathtaking way, giving you a story which is in a league of its own, different from anything else out there. So, being an avid fantasy fan, the promise of something like that was too much for me to resist. I was determined to read through the series, and I was dead set on testing my resilience by powering through the books, just as people said was going to be necessary. Nothing was going to deter an experienced fantasy fan like myself, you see. Maybe I was a bit arrogant when I first picked up the series, and I underestimated it a little bit, but still I considered myself more than capable of handling it. So, I diligently sat down and over the course of months read the first 5 novels in the series, powering through, and having done so, I figured the halfway point was a good touchstone for me to sit back, look at the series so far, and give my thoughts and my perspectives on it. So, I'm going to go through each of the first 5 books, giving my thoughts on each one, and ranking them in order of my most favorite to my least favorite, and in the end, I'll provide my overall thoughts on the series and Erikson's writing in what will be, I hope at least, an incredibly interesting and insightful breakdown. So, let's see if Malazan is really as scary as people say it is, and more importantly, let's see if it's worth it. The video is going to be full of spoilers, so be aware and proceed at your own risk. Now, starting off with my personal favorite of the first 5 novels, Memories of Ice. I rank this book as my personal favorite of the first 5, and my personal observations are that this is a common favorite amongst the fan base. Being the 3rd book in the series, I think a lot of what makes this a common favorite for many fans is the fact that Erikson pays off a lot of established lore and character development in this one. See, the series is notorious for taking you along these big jumps, transporting the reader to a completely different setting, an entirely different continent, with a completely different but still incredibly large and diverse cast of characters. This does make the reading experience quite jarring and definitely adds to the series being a difficult read. Instead of following along a familiar cast of characters and their personal story, at least in the initial stages of the series, which is a common approach to storytelling in these big fantasy series, and slowly, gradually expanding the world more and more, Erikson instead just parachutes you frequently in these different locations and settings, walloping you with the scope of his story. I think the reason why Memories of Ice ended up being so impactful to me and so gratifying is that it develops and pays off a lot of what is initially set up in the first book, Gardens of the Moon. Naturally, I think the reader develops a connection with the cast of characters he is initially introduced to, as they serve as his gateway to the wider story, and they form the initial emotional anchor to it. Maybe there is a bit of personal bias here as well, since I particularly liked Ericsson's characters from the first novel, and to this day, having read through more of the series, I still favor them over some of his other rosters located in some of the other locations. I enjoy Whiskey Jack and his crew, and that may be because I particularly enjoy what many describe as military fantasy, and the lives of this ragtag gang of very experienced and formidable soldiers was particularly alluring to me, corresponding to my individual taste. Whatever the reason, I find myself particularly invested in Whiskey Jack, the Bridge Burners, Paran, so returning to them after the pause of Book 2, which marks the first setting shift in the series, was particularly refreshing and enjoyable. But Memories of Ice offers far more than just a return to my favorite cast. It's also a particularly dense book which manages to pull off large-scale conflict masterfully. The main antagonistic force of the book is a particularly despicable force of crazed fanatics that are so abhorrent that you just can't help but root against them and wish for their demise. Contrast that with a very diverse and enjoyable cast of protagonists who you can comfortably root for, and the end result is that the conflict in the book is engaging and gripping. You want to see the Pantheon Domin destroyed, and you want to see Whiskey Jack and the crew succeed in their war effort against them. The Domin's forces are monstrously evil, though there is a tragic note to them, seeing as how you discover later in the books that these people were under the influence of magical manipulation, and seeing them fall and the heroes succeed against them is rewarding. Which brings me to my most favorite part of the book, the Siege of Capustan. The looming conflict set up in the books comes to a head in this truly epic siege. Erickson manages to pull off scale masterfully in his books, and the sheer size of this battle is truly something breathtaking. Battles like this are what distinguish Malazan in a league of its own in the fantasy genre. Despite the massive scale, you never truly feel lost, overwhelmed, or confused, which sometimes happens in these books. Erickson manages to ground this conflict through the perspectives of characters involved in it in a way where you feel like you are experiencing the personal stakes of each character, so the conflict resolution ends up being impactful and meaningful. My personal favorite standouts are Ictovian being an absolute badass, commanding the city defenses in such a stoic, disciplined, and strong-willed manner against overwhelming odds, while feeling the weight of his forces, who for all intents and purposes are like his family, his battle brothers and sisters, slowly being chipped away by wave after wave of crazed fanatics. By the end of it, the sheer stress and exhaustion of the battle lays almost crushingly on his shoulders, and yet, through the sheer force of his nobility, he perseveres against the odds. It's that type of character building that really grips me and makes me interested. Grunthal was another standout, going on this absolute rampage after discovering that his friends were hurt and tearing the Dominus forces to shreds. He is an example of how Erickson manages to ground the stakes of this massive conflict into something personal, making the reader root for the protagonist. I could not wait to see Grunthal wreck shit after the despicable and savage forces of the Domin dared lay a finger on his friend Stony, and I took an immense joy. I was almost gleeful in seeing him cleave away enemy after enemy, with every small victory being an almost insolent spit in the face of the Domin's forces, who, for all intents and purposes, looked destined to conquer and obliterate the city, thanks to their overwhelming numbers. And yet, the city stood tall in the end, and it was really cool to see. Capustan standing in defiance in the forces of the Domin, with these pockets of resistance forming while the city was overwhelmed by wave after wave, with our characters at the center of each one, characters who were seemingly dead set to not falter and to fight to the last drop of blood. All of it was truly exciting, rewarding, and frankly simply cool and badass. The whole battle is simply a masterclass put on by Erickson on how to pull off large-scale conflict while still retaining a sense of personal dramatic stakes. I can go on and on about just how cool the Siege of Capustan was, but that would make the video quite one note. The point is, I thoroughly enjoyed it, and it's enough to place Memories of Ice as my absolute favorite of the series so far. There's more to the book than just the siege. that really makes it an enjoyable read. The ending resolution to the tragic fate of the bridge burners, the union struck with the Barghasts, the ascension of the wolf gods Tog and Fandaray, Tok the Younger's painful journey, Ictovian redeeming the Clan Amas, the Kachain Chamale being a constant terrifying presence. The book is simply chock full with cool and satisfying moments that make it a thoroughly enjoyable read, definitely deserving the top spot. In the number 2 place, I have put the second book in the series, Death House Gates. 2 words are enough to justify this pick. The Dog Chain. That plotline blew my mind away. I was taken aback at how Erikson can have multiple battles, each of which would be a final book-ending battle in its own right in any other fantasy series, and somehow string them together, fight after fight. Once again, the sheer scope and scale is breathtaking. What I also thoroughly enjoyed is how Erikson showcases the tragic human cost of war through the dog chain. You see the suffering of the refugees, the battle fatigue that slowly overwhelms the soldiers, the grief, that loss of life that slowly piles on and almost overwhelms the Malazan forces. And contrast that to the sheer will to live, the tenacious and resolute defiance on their part to just keep going, keep winning battle after battle against the odds. And that's all capped off by a tragic end when the heroes manage to achieve their goals and the refugees are saved, but at a terrible tragic cost, all bookended by an epic and truly last stand on part of the one and only Coltane, who is the absolute MVP of this book. The whole thing is an emotionally turbulent, meaningful, and impactful experience, and it's enough to earn Book 2 my second spot. Where the book falls short and why I can't put it in the top spot is in some of the ancillary plot lines. Though I don't harbor a dislike for Felicine and her story with Heberic and Bowden like some people seem to do, I did find the particular plotline to be confusing at times. It all comes down to Erikson's tendency to show and not explain at all costs. As a result, I found myself confused and at times at a loss as to what exactly was happening to these characters. We learn in future books about what some of what happened actually meant, but actually experiencing these events without any explanation was frankly exhausting at times. Further, Erikson chooses to bring in the strange lore related to the Auto Trial and the Jade Giants, which is then again touched upon in later books, and I personally am just not a fan of this lore element as a whole. It's simply a little bit too much out there and too abstract for me, and I just didn't find it palatable. I'm also not as of yet sure what the relevance of this particular element to the overall plot is and how it's impactful to our characters, and as a result I simply find myself not caring too much about it. Similar criticisms can be levied at the story involving Mappo, Icarium, Crocus, and the rest, and the Azad House. Though the Azad House lore was a bit more established and clearly conveyed thanks to earlier books, so I didn't find it as being so out there like the whole thing with the Jade Giants, the rules and characters of this particular element of the lore was still, to my mind, not sufficiently established for me to understand exactly what was happening. This is a criticism of Erikson's overall writing, which I'll touch upon more when we discuss some of the later books, but this absolute categorical aspiration not to tell at all costs that Erikson has can really serve as a detriment to the story and the reader's experience at times. To this day, I still don't know exactly what happened in the Azad house with Mappo and Icarium because nothing is explained or clearly conveyed to the audience, so I am at a loss as to why what happened was even important and how it's relevant. So I found myself simply wanting for the whole sequence to end as fast as possible so we could return back to elements of the story where I was actually invested in. This does serve as a detriment to the reading experience of the book, and it's the primary reason why I would put it in second place and not at number 1. Which brings me to the third spot in my ranking, this being the first book in the series, Gardens of the Moon. Gardens takes a lot of flack for being a rocky start to the series due to Erikson being an inexperienced writer in the beginning, and I definitely feel like his skills did improve as the series went by, reflected in my rankings of the books so far. I do still feel like Gardens offers a lot of enjoyable elements, though it doesn't have enough for me to distinguish it as an absolute favorite. It also doesn't have as much for me to dislike as some of the later novels do. I think the book is fine. It provides you with an engaging cast of characters. I'm partial to the bridge burner, so I guess that's reflected in the rankings here, but I also really like the banter and hijinks of the Drujistan bunch. The book also benefits from a smaller scale, though still having a larger scale than some other fantasy series have as a whole, and serves as a decent entry point to the series. Overall, the book does just enough to be put smack dab in the middle of the ranking. Not too good, but not too bad either. On a side note, Ralek Nam has been sleeping in the Azad house for like 5 books now. When the hell is he gonna actually finally wake up? Guess I'm gonna find out in book 6 onwards, though I'm not sure how much I'm gonna care for his return, considering I've had 5 books separating me from him as a character, which kind of serves to diminish my emotional investment in him. He has had no arc, no development, and even if he does wake up and him waking up is going to end up being impactful to the story, I don't know how impactful it's going to be to me as a reader. Anyway, time to proceed with number 4. The number 4 spot fittingly belongs to the 4th book in the series, House of Chains. Though some people rank this book a lot higher thanks to the improvements in Erikson's writing style, for me the book just ended up being a bit of a flop. Though it pays off characters from Death House Gates, it doesn't do as good of a job as Memories of Ice in paying off the characters from book 1. I simply didn't find it satisfying as a payoff. The entire book builds up to a massive final battle, tracking the progress of the Malazan pacifying force through a variety of perspectives like Fiddler and Gamuts. It also lays down the variety of different interests and intrigues in Shaik's camp, promising a tangled knot that you are excited as a reader to see unraveled. You are kept on the edge of your seat asking, is the Malazan army going to be enough? How the different intrigues in Shaik's camp going to influence the final battle? Expecting a complex and rewarding resolution, only to have the main conflict be resolved by an out-of-nowhere appearance of an army of magical ghosts. It was a bit underwhelming and unsatisfying, to say the least. Further on to that, Shaik's abrupt execution, though definitely being unexpected, left me wondering why the hell we spent so much time with Felisin and exploring her tortured, conflicted character at all in book 2. Maybe there's more to this that will be touched upon and further developed in later books, and I'll get what the point of it was, but as a standalone, self-contained in a single book story, I found the resolution to be a bit pointless and underwhelming. There is also another plotline I also found myself a bit dragged down by, that of Troll and Onrak. Though they are both cool characters and have their moments, their storyline marks the start of something that I consider to be a detrimental trend later picked up in book 5 in Erikson's writing, namely the endless pontification. While being present in earlier books, like for example Mappo and Icarium have some great, deeply analytical philosophical conversations in book 2, here the endless philosophizing by the characters takes a step from being engaging and intriguing into being tiring and a bit annoying. Onrak and Troll constantly have these enigmatic, rambly, pseudo-philosophical conversations, all of which are open-ended, and I personally didn't get what the relevance of any of them to the story and the plot was. It all comes off as a bit self-indulgent. Erikson is obviously a very intelligent man and is a deep thinker, and at times I've enjoyed his tendency to philosophize when done sparingly. But conversations between characters have to carry relevance and particular purpose to the story itself for them to be engaging to the reader and not just deep and complex simply for the sake of being deep and complex. I found myself feeling like a lot of what was being said could have been said in a lot more of a concise and simple manner, conveying the message much more effectively to the reader, but instead, Erikson made what comes off as a very deliberate choice to frame these conversations in a needlessly complex manner. It's my personal belief that the greatest skill of a great mind is to be able to phrase complex things in a simple way, not simple things in complex ways. The whole thing just comes off as needlessly verbose. Further, following up on the trend common to Erikson's writing as a whole, you are given no necessary context to what happens and what the characters are actually talking about, so you end up being at a loss as to what is actually being said and why it matters. You're given the context in Book 5, but at that point it's too little too late. The experience of reading through these endless pontifications was simply tiring. Onrak and Truhl's exchanges feel like they drag on endlessly and really slow the whole book down, at least in my experience. So thanks to this strange choice leading to an unsatisfying resolution and a tendency for the book to drag on a bit, Book 4 ranks as number 4 in my rankings. Which brings me to the final spot in this ranking, belonging to Book 5, Midnight Tides. Maybe it's because at this point all the way in Book 5 I was tired of the sudden shifts in setting, but this book did the least for me in terms of enjoyment. It simply feels so far removed from what I consider to be the main story. I didn't even feel like it was a Malazan book in a weird way. Having to accumulate to not only a new continent with its own distinct politics, countries and cultures, an entire new cast of characters, but a whole new mythology was difficult. Though having some connection to the wider Malazan world, it still felt a bit too separated from the story and the world I knew so far. Having holds instead of warrens with their own whole new way of working and functioning is an example of that. It was simply, I think, a little bit too much at this point for so far in the series. I didn't find myself caring too much about the Lethery and the Adur. Some people really enjoyed Tehold and Bug's interactions, but to me they came off almost a bit goofy, like they knew too much and were too witty almost to the point that undermined the dramatic stakes of what was happening. I didn't get the point of Hulbedict and what his role in the story was supposed to be. I didn't like the Walking Dead that were so casually introduced in this book, just having random dead people and magic that can undo death so casually introduced in the story. With Ascension, for example, you do get a bit of that, but at least when characters ascend after death, they transcend to a new realm of existence, which for some reason makes it more acceptable to me than just having walking sentient corpses for no apparent reason, just thrown in there and you being asked to just run with it. In general, I think playing around with death like that in a story is dangerous. It can really shatter and diminish dramatic stakes if characters can just return from death like that. Like, it renders death meaningless, which makes things like sacrifice, honor, the will to fight on, things that were very effectively conveyed in earlier books as themes meaningless in turn. The whole reason why death doesn't work properly in Lethery was a bit too out there and convoluted, to be honest. I just didn't get the point of it. Further, the whole tendency of Erikson to overcomplicate his dialogue and his prose with endless pontification in this book, it's the worst compared to earlier ones. Every character in this book is a philosopher, even though it doesn't seem like they should be. Instead of adding to the diversity of a cast of characters, when you make every character a deep thinker prone to pondering philosophically, they end up just all feeling one note. Instead of enriching the world, the endless pontificating ends up dragging the whole experience as a reader down. It's the main reason why I said that, to my mind, this tendency to offer deep philosophical observations from the author should be done sparingly and appropriately to the specific character and to the unfolding story, rather than being a general trend. As a result, the book has a tendency to drag on, even more so than Book 4, where at least the pontificating was confined mostly to one plotline. I did enjoy Troll more in this book, but that's to be expected, seeing as how he receives a lot more screen time and we understand a lot more about his character. So that's a positive, I guess. I did like Tseda Kurukan and Briss Bedict. The final standoff in the throne room was also pretty cool too, I guess. But overall, the book simply does not do enough for me, and at times it's a struggle to get through. Which at this point in Book 5, I feel like should not be the case. We should have the bare bones of the story laid out, and we should be developing and paying off, not setting up things still. The necessity for powering through should be diminished as compared to earlier books. We should be well underway. Overall, my least favorite book in the series so far, and deserving of its 5th spot in my ranking. So, after having ranked and talked about the books, let's go back to some of the original questions as it relates to the overall series I laid out in the beginning. Is Malazan difficult to get into? Certainly. Is it a tough read at times? Absolutely. Will you have to power through? More so than you ever expected. But is it worth it? Overall, I would say yes. When Erikson's writing works, it works in a spectacular fashion. He is truly capable of giving you moments, events that truly don't compare to anything else in fantasy. In that sense, the common conception that all the struggle in reading the series is worth it, I think, holds up. But is it a struggle? At times, it certainly is. When Erikson's writing style doesn't work, or maybe simply it's not working for you personally, it can really drag the whole story down and make for a challenging reading experience. Overall, I'm happy I read the series so far, and will continue on to finishing the whole thing eventually, because I do think the positives are truly spectacular and make the slog you have to go through at times truly worthwhile. I'll be back eventually with the later half of the series to give my overall thoughts, but until then, remember our motto: first in, last out.